I'd like to begin with the elephant in the room, the sort of conversation that is preoccupying everybody, that is global trade, at the center of which is the United States. Can you update us on the conversations with the United States? What is the status of your negotiations with the U.S.?
Yeah, well, first I'll speak as the chair of the G7. You know, we hosted colleagues in Banff recently in Canada. The mission was to get back to basis, you know, to look at, you know, how we could bring stability and growth. What I've said this morning in a number of plenary was we cannot allow uncertainty to become the new certainty. You know, we need to restore consumer confidence, we need to restore business confidence, we need to restore investor confidence. And it's incumbent upon, obviously, the G7 countries. We'll have a meeting, a virtual meeting tomorrow. It's also incumbent upon the G20 to adopt policies and to deal with the issues we're facing together so that we bring back that level of certainty that is so much needed. You know, I always say stability, predictability in the rule of law is an high demand and short supply. And therefore for us, and what you feel, you know, sadly in a way, it seems that, you know, you are in a place where you kind of normalize trade restriction and some level of tariffs. And obviously this has created a number of tensions, and therefore we seem to be in a world where, you know, this is becoming more the norm in terms of some trade restriction and some tariffs, you know, imposed on different countries.
And then in terms of the conversations that you're having with the Trump administration, more specifically, because the Europeans have basically come to terms with the idea that they're not going to get 0 for 0. Would you consider that 0 for 0 as an ambition is dead from Canada's point of view?
Well, I'd say the Prime Minister of Canada has been, you know, speaking on that. He said, and I support that. He said there's little evidence to suggest that, you know, you can have a trade deal with the United States without tariffs. I mean, there's little evidence to suggest that. When you look at the world today, that's what I'm saying. It seems that seemingly what you've seen time and time again, that you know, there's some level of trade restriction and some level of tariffs that have been imposed
so where do you think
pretty much all countries.
Where do you think that baseline is going to be for Canada, and at what baseline does Canada then have to retaliate?
Well, listen, we said a number of things to our American friends. First of all, we want to work together. So obviously, we're going to continue. We're going to double down on our negotiation. You know, Canada is an important partner for the United States. I remind our American friends always that we are the largest customer in the United States. We buy more from the U.S. than China, Japan, the UK, and France combined. We are the second largest investor in the United States, and also the distinction between Canada and others is the nature, the integrated nature of our supply chain. So a decision on one side of the border has an impact on both sides, just the nature of things. So we're going to double down in our effort to negotiate the best possible deal for Canada and Canadian workers. At the same time, we're certainly going to make sure we have measures to protect our industry and our workers. And we're going to build Canada. You know, the Prime Minister has been quoted as saying, you know, we can give ourselves far more than anyone can take away from us. And that's why you've seen that kind of sentiment in Canada to build more infrastructure, to diversify the market, because, you know, Canada is a large G7 country. You know, we're the only G7 country with a free trade agreement with all other G7 nations. So in a sense, we are in a great position to diversify. If you look at the pillar of growth, Canada offers a number of opportunities, and it's obvious when you talk to colleagues here at the G20.
In every sort of negotiation, there's a stick and a carrot side of the negotiation. On the carrot side of things, are you willing to talk about dairy duties, or is that a red line for Canada? And on the stick side, do digital taxes come back, digital services taxes come back if you fail to get a deal?
Well, we've been clear from the get-go that the issue around supply management is off the table, so that's step one. When it comes to the digital service tax, we have made our position clear. We have heard from the President. We always anticipated that'd be part of a larger discussion. But I would say in the same time in that week, we probably talk less about that, but the fact that the G7 issue a statement on Section 899 and finding a compromise position where we'll have a dual system, I think this is a great achievement. You know, for me, my job as the chair of the G7 is to maintain unity in the G7, but also to find common ground. I mean, this was a place where we could find common ground, and I hope, you know, tomorrow we'll have a discussion with the G7 colleagues, and certainly I always say all the answers are around the table. You know, if you talk about energy, natural resources, critical minerals. So we should be addressing the big issues, which is overcapacity, non-market practices. That's really what's hurting our domestic economy, and we're best placed to address these issues together.
And you say that the solutions are always at the table, but not everybody is always at the table. For example, Scott Bessent is absent from this meeting. Donald Trump left the meeting in Canada a little bit early. I'd like to have your understanding in terms of negotiating with a larger bloc, say, than Canada, the EU. Do you think that we will reach a position where it would make sense for Canada to band up with other like countries, the EU, Canada, South Korea, Japan? Or is that a conversation that you're having? You had that meeting a little bit earlier today.
Well, I mean, first of all, we'll have a virtual meeting with Secretary Bessent tomorrow. I understand he's traveling, so we're going to be making sure we can be connecting together. The other thing today, what I think resonated the most, and I started with that in our interview, is that we cannot let uncertainty become the new certainty. I think that is probably the word that you've heard the most in the sessions today was the word uncertainty. So I said it's incumbent upon us to make sure that uncertainty is not the new certainty in the world. That, seemingly, it seems to suggest in what we've seen that, there'll be trade restrictions. We'll be in a world of trade restrictions. There'll be in a world also of tariffs. But we need to find ways to work together to address this issue, these issues, which are all related, sooner would be the better, because what we need to provide back to the market is that level of confidence so that investors, consumer, and businesses can start investing again, and that we find a way forward. So that is the issue we've been tackling today, and that's the one certainly we're going to be talking tomorrow. Resiliency of supply chain, making sure we work together, because what we need also to address is vulnerabilities. And that is very clear when you look at supply chains and how we can address these vulnerabilities.
And on the question also on Ukraine, you just came from the recovery conference in Rome, so you met with a number of the Ukrainian delegation and others in Europe, the European ones. Donald Trump now says he's willing to sell more arms to the Ukrainians if NATO, the Europeans, pay for it. Would Canada join into that program to buy more arms for Ukraine?
Well, we've been there since the beginning. Canada invested close to 22 billion Canadian dollar to support Ukraine. The thing that we have said also very significantly at the G7, you may recall when we had the meeting in Banff, thanks to the work that we've done with Secretary Bessent, we said very clearly that anyone who supported Russia in its unjustified war against Ukraine cannot benefit directly or indirectly from the reconstruction. This is a baseline. G7 was very clear on that. This is something that was reaffirmed also at the reconstruction conference in Rome. And certainly just on the reconstruction, I'll come to the arms, but just think about that. People were saying this is kind of the Marshall Plan for the 21st century, because if you look at the IMF figure, to reconstruct Ukraine, you're talking of north of $525 billion for about a decade. So certainly there's a lot to be done. Canada has made its last installment on the loan acceleration of $5 billion. So when it comes to how we can support further Ukraine, Canada has always been at the table, so we'll certainly look at the proposal that is being put on the table.
And is there a point, just to return to the trade conversation, you talk about uncertainty being, the great enemy here. Is there sort of any deal, even a kind of bad deal, at a certain point better than just prolonged and indefinite uncertainty on tariffs?
No, you want a fair deal. You want a good deal. You want to make sure that, I can talk for us, that the deal would be protecting our industry, our worker, and our national interest. And I think that's why we are at the table. That's why we're doubling down. And I will just tell you, that more and more people understand when you're talking about these big trading blocs, whether you talk about Canada, the EU, or Japan, South Korea, there's a nexus also between energy security, economic security, and national security. So we need to find a space where we can put these things on the table and come to an agreement. Although I would say, like I said, the evidence suggests now that, we are in a world where there'll be some form, sadly, of trade restrictions that have been put in place and some level of tariffs. That's what you see around the world. But from our perspective, for us, we are going to double down to make sure that we can get the best possible deal in the interest of Canada, and making sure at the same time, when it's in the interest of Canada, is making sure that we make North America more competitive at the same time. Because you want to preserve competitiveness, you want to preserve investments, and you want to preserve would have made this North American economy resilient over decades.